Never gets easy talking to groups of people, and I'm always quite nervous. So I'll start by saying, first of all, thank you for choosing to spend your time coming here and learning about coffee and coffee roasting and listening to people like me drone on. So my name is Rob, and I like to turn green brown. Anybody else? I often say simple things like that, like turn green brown, mostly because I feel really uncomfortable when people make a big deal out of anything that I'm doing. It feels really uncomfortable and awkward. But it is definitely me kind of glossing over a whole level of complexity that exists within our industry and within most of our jobs. And in coffee roasting, the devil does tend to be in the details. Because what we're actually doing is very complex. It's this weird mixture of artistry, craftspersonship, and science kind of all meeting together in order to take the potential that exists in green coffee and express it in a particular way as roasted coffee. In a nutshell, that's kind of what we do every day. Now, for those, how many production roasters I got in the house? Woohoo! It feels like a slog, doesn't it? It doesn't feel so romantic as how I'm describing it right now most days, right? It's lift the green bucket, dump it in the hopper, or if you're lucky, you've got a vacuum lift. Do the same thing multiple times in a row, especially like 12 batches of dark roast, back to back to back, right? And then, rinse and repeat sort of thing. But everything that we do is in service of translating the potential of that coffee into a roasted coffee product. But there is no such thing as translation without interpretation. What I learned in my liberal arts degree, which I very infrequently use, because one of the things we did was we translated literature. And one of the things I learned when translating literature from one language to a different language, you necessarily have to make interpretive choices. There's no such thing as a pure translation of anything. And when it comes to coffee and coffee roasting, it's really very similar because every single choice that we make, the roast length, the time to first crack, development time, roast color, weight loss for our final weight loss percentage, all of these things are necessarily limiting and guiding the potential of that coffee to make it into something different. How many people here have ground up and drank brewed green coffee? If you haven't, you should try it. It's a very different experience. Use a grinder you don't like, though. But it tastes totally different because what we're doing isn't just turning green brown, but we're engaging in a transformative process that changes the characteristics of the coffee into something that we can actually drink and imbibe and enjoy. If you enjoy green coffee, I'm not here to judge you. You do you. But I personally prefer mine is roasted. So the data that we take in the process of this active translation or active interpretation is important because it actually guides us. It gives us real-time feedback into what we're doing and gives us ideas as to how we could make choices to better improve our product. And when we talk about the devil in the details when it comes to coffee roasting, what I want to do today is just examine every small little detail that I pay attention to when I'm profiling, roasting, and doing product development on coffee and see how that impacts the overall quality and characteristics of the coffee. So that's kind of what we've got in line for us today. And honestly, the coffee roasting process starts way before we ever actually start roasting coffee. How many people in here are production roasters who also get to have a say in green buying? How many people are just production roasters with no say in green buying? I feel so sorry. There's only one. I'm so sorry. Us green buyers are an awful mess sometimes. One of the things I often help people do in my line of consulting is the green buyer wants one thing and they bought the coffee for one reason. And then the person doing production roasting gets in contact with me because they're like, how? They bought this for a particular reason, but how do I translate it? So in green buying is where the details begin because within green buying, we're usually taking moisture content. Sometimes we're taking density. We're taking information like the altitude in which the coffee was grown, what processing method was used, what types of cultivated varieties are in use for that coffee. All of that data we're taking and accumulating. We're also then roasting the coffee so that we can taste it to decide whether or not we want to purchase it. All of these are moments of data acquisition. And while I'm going to get to green coffee metrics a little later on in the talk, I do want to touch on one thing, which is every time anyone touches the coffee, you have a chance to learn from the data you collect. So people who are green buyers raise your hands. People that have green buying say, here's my challenge to you. It's not technically SCA protocol to take down the profile of your sample roast. I would strongly encourage you to take down the profile of your sample roast. Because if you chose to buy this coffee, it means you loved it with a particular roast profile in mind. And it's going to get your coffee roaster, whether that's you or someone else, the poor person who is only doing production roasting, it's going to give them a head start in the process. Because by them being able to understand when you hit first crack, how long you developed the coffee, what the roast color was, if you're able to take that, or at least what the weight loss percentage is, you're going to give your production roasting team a head start, or you're going to give yourself a head start when it comes to actually profiling and developing the coffee. So we're going to go into the green coffee stuff here next, but that's kind of where I want to leave that. And the one bit of advice, because there's so many people here who will give you much better wisdom into green coffee, because that's their area of expertise. I literally, as I said, turned green, brown. That's, if you need to hire someone for that, that's me. If it's something else, maybe look somewhere else. Hire a marketing consultant. They're going to grow your business faster than roasting good coffee will. So that, it's kind of a joke, but also not really. But the green buying advice I'm going to give you is this. Be guided by why. Why are you buying a coffee? I've run into people all over the world who have the same problem that I have, which is I tasted something delicious on the cupping table and I want it, right? If you buy coffee without a clear use in mind, it is going to sit on your shelf, it is going to get old, and it is going to lose the characteristics that you bought the coffee for. It takes a lot to roll out a coffee in terms of coming up with labels, packaging design, marketing, social media, all the sorts of things that go behind launching a single coffee. So if you really, really love a coffee and you have a spot for it, then go for it and buy it. If you really, really love a coffee and don't have a spot for it, convince one of your friends to buy it so you can buy the roasted coffee off of them, and it's their problem. But now what we're going to look at is the stuff that we as production roasters will be able to get our hands on in terms of green coffee metrics and small details before we roast. So green buying aside. There are a couple different metrics that I think are really, really important to look at, and I'm going to go through each of these at length. So moisture content is one of the most important bits of information that I tend to take. And it sounds kind of asinine because a lot of people take moisture content. The importers take moisture content. Everybody takes moisture content. But how does it actually impact our roasting? And there's a couple ways in which moisture content can impact our roasting. One of the first ones is just aging. There was an amazing study done by Cafe Imports by Ian and the team there that measured moisture content in relation to water activity and found that there was a correlation. That coffees above 11.5% moisture content tended to have higher water activity, tended to age faster, and lose their qualities quicker. If you're buying a coffee that has higher moisture content, you might want to consider how you're actually queuing that up for release. Because the higher the moisture content, the faster you need to work through the coffee so that it doesn't decline. Okay, so that's the first bit. Moisture content is important for your order of operations in terms of picking which coffee goes in the blend next. The second thing is going to be that moisture content is going to give you some insight into its resistance to heat energy transfer. Water does some really weird stuff in coffee roasting, and I've shown this in slides in the past for roast, so you could go back and look at all the old roast summits and probably see one of these slides pop up. But one of the fun things and crazy things about water content is this. It helps transmit heat energy into the coffee seed a little faster until it gets to boiling point. As water gets heated closer and closer to that 100 degrees centigrade, it starts to go through the latent heat of vaporization, which is the amount of energy that it takes for it to change from 100 degrees C as a liquid to 100 degrees C as a gas. That takes more energy for it to make that phase change than it takes for us to heat it up from 0 degrees centigrade to 100 degrees centigrade. What's even more complicated about it is as we're roasting, because the elasticity of the actual structure of the coffee, it's able to hold a lot of the pressure. As it's holding the pressure and the pressure increases, what happens to the boiling point of water? It goes up. So we're constantly chasing this boiling point of water up and up and up and up. We're constantly throwing heat energy at it, trying to get it to go through phase change so that we can have a really big spike of pressure so we can go through first crack. And we're just chasing it the whole way. The more moisture content you have in a coffee, the harder it's going to be to roast it. You're going to have to push a lot more heat energy in at it. So if you take a coffee and you say, I want to hit this first crack at 8 minutes, okay? And you have a 10% moisture content coffee, that's going to be relatively easy to do depending on your machine, batch size, all that sort of stuff that we're just going to gloss over for this hypothetical situation. If you have a 11.5 or 12% moisture content coffee, you're probably going to have to throw everything in the kitchen sink at it to get it to hit first crack at 8 minutes. You're going to have to charge hotter. You're going to have to use higher burner. You may have to restrict airflow at the beginning of the roast to concentrate heat energy in the hot box so your inlet temperature goes up so that the coffee roasts faster. Moisture content's a huge deal for that. Another thing that it actually helps us to understand, and I must credit Drew Billups for this, one of the first Roast Magazine summits that we had, Drew introduced an idea that really just kind of, I don't know, codified things that I had been experiencing in my own roasting. And that is that he suggests that you aim for a particular weight loss percentage above the initial moisture content. Because one of the things that we know is that moisture content is primarily what we're losing when we're roasting. The majority of it is moisture content. And if your moisture content increases by 1%, then your weight loss will also increase by about 1%. If the coffee ages and loses moisture content over the course of you owning it, your weight loss will also decrease by a proportional percentage. So Drew recommended 2 to 3% moisture content, or 2 to 3% weight loss above your original moisture content is his guide. I'm a little bit more risky. I like 1 to 2 for my light roasts, but you do you. There have been a couple times where I've gotten 0.5% above my weight loss, or my initial moisture content for my weight loss, and it's tasted great. One of the things you'll learn about me is I think coffee is kind of more like jazz music, or whose line is it anyway, where everything's made up and the points don't matter. We have rules, we have guidelines, but you will inevitably run into a coffee that violates your expectations. So always hold everything with a grain of salt, especially anything I say. The second thing I want to look at is growing altitude. So the altitude of growth at which the coffee has been grown has often been used in our industry to indicate whether it's a hard bean, soft bean, high altitude, low altitude, that sort of thing. And there's certain intrinsic ideas that come along with that. So generally speaking, we've taken altitude as a proxy for density. Anybody heard this before? High altitude, high density, low altitude, low density? Yeah? Cool. No, not a lot of people. All right. Well, it's true sometimes, but not always. There was a really fun experiment I got to do with a coffee from the Galapagos, which was grown at 200 meters above sea level. And it was denser than a lot of the Kenyan coffees that I had been purchasing. So density and altitude, while sometimes correlated, are not always correlated. It can be a proxy for density. Altitude of growth, though, for me, the biggest indicator that I get for this is how can it take the heat. Lower altitude coffees, not lower density, lower altitude coffees will be more susceptible to certain roasting defects like tipping that higher altitude coffees don't experience in the same way. You can roast a higher altitude coffee faster and push more heat energy on it and have it hold up to that, generally speaking. Once again, it's coffee. There are always exceptions, but that tends to be the case for me. It is also connected with sugar content as well as acidity, etc. So the higher altitude of growth, generally speaking, the more sugar content you tend to find in those seeds, the more acidity you tend to find. But once again, this is kind of a loose correlation because really altitude tends to control the growth and maturation of the plant, how many cherries grow on the tree. Higher altitude coffee tends to grow a little less, tend to get a little bit more in each of the cherries and seeds. I'm really dumbing this down, so other green coffee experts will be able to give you much more detail and probably better information later. But that's what I think of when I think of growth altitude. So if I'm buying high altitude coffee, I expect acidity, I expect complexity, and I usually expect it to be a little bit denser, but not always. Density, on the other hand, you'll see I put a question mark by this. Density used to be one of the things I would look at for how hard can I push a coffee? How fast can I roast it? Will it take the heat? The reason there's a question mark behind it is because I don't know that it actually correlates with that data for me anymore. Generally speaking, denser coffee is denser, probably is going to be better in terms of the quality of the coffee, but it doesn't necessarily mean I can roast it really fast. For example, the Galapagos coffee. Couldn't roast it fast. Well, actually, I could roast it fast, but I had to do a whole bunch of other stuff to get it to work. Anyway, side point. Density, generally speaking, it's good to take, but I don't know exactly what to tell you to do with it. Should you take the information? Yes, always, because eventually some sort of correlation might show up. But at the moment, I take it, and then it doesn't really influence my roasting nearly as much as the moisture content of the coffee and the growing altitude. Hardness is another one that's really interesting. So I picked this up from a member of my mentorship group. So I run a mentorship group online. And one of them was saying, hey, Barista Hustle started playing around with the idea of bean hardness. And so I went out and bought a Shore D hardness meter, which you take and you press it down into the seed and it measures how hard the seed is, theoretically. First of all, plus or minus 1. So if you have one of those meters, the industry standard is plus or minus 1 for people that use Shore D. Not industry as in coffee, because we don't have a standard for it yet, I don't believe. But anything plus or minus 1 will tend to be about the same measurement. That being said, hardness, unsurprisingly, correlates to moisture content and density. And people in the farming communities of coffee have known this for a long time, because how do you tell if a coffee is dry when you're in the field? Yeah, you can slide it, you can take a bite down on it, all these sorts of things. And so if the coffee's moisture, you push down with the Shore D meter and the little pokey thing just goes straight on through it, and or the bean just splits in half, which it's not very hard, right? So hardness tends to be correlated with that. It also seems to be correlated with density a little bit. Still playing around with hardness to see if it helps at all. I did want to see if maybe the endosperm cap had a different hardness than the rest of the bean, but it's really hard to hold the bean like this and then shove a sharp pointy metal thing at your own hand, trying to hit the endosperm cap. So I kind of gave up on that for the moment until I have some sort of better way of dealing with it. The last thing for green is variety. There is a roast article that they've invited me to write, which is forthcoming, on roasting different cultivated varieties. And then I'm also working on a book on this because I'm in the middle of the research section of it right now. So I'm not going to say too much because I need to finish the research before I can tell you anything very specific. But what I want to tell you today is that different coffee varieties respond differently to different roast profiles. It's totally fine if you want to have one style of roasting that you do. Like, we go fast. We're like Sonic the Hedgehog here, right? You just go fast. That's cool. It's probably going to cause you to naturally limit the varieties of coffee that you're buying to those that tend to do well under fast roasting conditions. There are coffee roasting varieties that do not do well under fast roasting conditions. So I would encourage you to take that into mind as well. One of the things that's not mentioned here as well is, and it's a huge miss on my part, the processing method. The different processing methods, and it's shades in a spectrum. It's not, these hard cast categories. But different processing methods will tend to take roast differently. So these are the details that I tend to take in order to pay attention. Just the real quick bit of it. Natural processed coffees, I tend to do shorter development times and lower in temperatures. Wash processed coffees, I tend to do a little bit longer development times, a little higher in temperatures, and honey processed coffees tend to fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum for me. That's incredibly loose information, but gets you the general gist of it. So now we move on from green coffee metrics to other things that happen before the green coffee actually makes it into the coffee roaster, which is our preheating setup. Number one, time spent warming up. There is no substitute for taking the right amount of time, because even if your air temperatures get up to temperature fast enough, it takes some time for the metal to soak up the heat energy. So you have to give it that time. Generally speaking, 45 minutes to 60 minutes in the morning for your preheat, almost regardless of roaster size. And then your between batch probably needs to have at least 2 to 5 minutes or somewhere in there in order to make sure that the heat energy in the system is back up to some sort of equilibrium. Your air temperatures might spike up really fast after you've discharged the coffee into the cooling tray. You might think, oh, I can just jump in right now, but the metal's not going to be reheated all the way. So you do need to take your time and kind of have something set there. Preheating temperatures. Notice, well, you may not notice. So this is actually meant to be exhaust air and inlet air. And the reason that I'm showing these two, and one of the things that I focus on a lot in my roasting is monitoring air temperatures while roasting. If you have the ability to, having exhaust air temperatures or the temperature of the air coming out of the drum, as well as inlet air temperatures, is going to improve your roasting game like whoa, okay? When you're preheating, you want to make sure that not only is your exhaust air temperature on point, but you also want the temperature of the air coming in the inlet of the drum to be accurate as well. They're going to be different. They're not going to be the same. As you can see in this example, you know, our exhaust air is down here, our inlet air is up here. We don't need them to be the same as each other, but we do need them to be the same as what they're supposed to be for our roasting profile. Okay? By checking the incoming air and the outgoing air, knowing that you've had the appropriate amount of time, you have a pretty fair amount of confidence that the roaster is preheated appropriately. When you charge in, you're not going to get any surprises. I do also throw bean temperature into this mix. There just wasn't room because it would actually be down in the stage somewhere if I were to draw it accurately. That was a joke. It wouldn't be in the stage. It's digital. But thank you for the pity laugh. That was awesome. But, you know, I would look at all of those all put together. And so generally speaking, I charge off my exhaust temperature. My exhaust temperature is on point. My inlet air temperature needs to be within a certain range, and my bean temperature needs to be within a certain range of my ideal charge in order to make sure everything is all put together. And then finally, control settings. It's very important to make sure that when you're preheating, you have a standard set of control settings that you have set that you use every single time, whether it's between batch, preheat, etc. And so if you have your airspeed set correctly, and you have your burner set correctly, but your drum isn't set correctly, it will change what your preheat condition looks like because it's spinning slower over the flame, it's picking up heat energy differently, the paddles aren't mixing the air quite as much, and so all of your other measurements actually don't work out as well. So I've accidentally done this when I've been doing experiments, left my drum speed set wrong. Everything looks great. My inlet temperature is great, my exhaust temperature is great, my bean temperature looks good, I drop the coffee in, and we are off to the races. It takes off on me faster than I can get a handle on. So you have to make sure that everything is set appropriately every single time in between batch. So figure out what that means for your roaster. If you need to have a little recipe card on the computer or on the side desk of the computer, have that all set. But that's definitely what I would recommend doing. All right, now we can put the green coffee in the machine and start taking data. Right? Does everybody take all this data so far? Everybody's got these written down for their own roasters? Yeah? Woo! That was less confident. It's really helpful. And one of the things, I'm going to go on this diatribe later, but I'm just going to say this now. Your weight loss is a free measurement. If you are not taking weight loss, I will probably shame you when we get on a phone call together. Because it's free, and I've warned you, right? I have clients who I've warned them, I think 20 times at this point, some of them. And they still call me, they're like, oh, I don't know what's going on. The roast seems different. I'm like, what's the weight loss difference? Oh, I don't know. It's free. You have a scale. You've got buckets. Make it happen, okay? I understand not being able to afford a $2,000 color meter. Totally get that. But weight loss is free. Just take it. Diatribe aside, roasting controls. Let's start talking about what we do when we actually start roasting. So now we got bean temperature in the mix here. The first thing I want to talk about is air temperatures. And one of the things that was really a catalyst for me to understand coffee roasting differently than I had before was when I went to an SCA course and I heard the president of ProBot get up and say that the ProBot roasting machines are generally speaking roughly 70% convective heat energy transfer or more. Before then, I had been operating under the assumption that, you know, most roasting machines have a lot of conduction, and you hear that in the industry, like, oh, you got to get that cast iron heat. Although a cast iron drum is rare because they're heavy and it would be really difficult to spin up. But you hear these things on the industry and on forums and just kind of bouncing around. Most of what we do historically came from the innovation of using forced convective heat energy transfer inside the roasting drum. Before then, roasting times were very long, less easy to control, and usually happening in closed-in drums over coal fires, which I guess you want a closed-in drum then because coal smoke and all that, unless you like that sort of flavor, then good for you. when we're roasting is we're applying a tremendous amount of convective heat energy transfer to the coffee. Conduction, yes. Radiation, yes, but convection primarily. And when we actually start using our air temperatures real time, it helps our roasting so much. This is the other reason I recommend adding an inlet temperature probe. It's not just for preheat. For that matter, your exhaust air temperature is also not just for preheat. You should look at it during roasting. You should be taking that data with your data loggers. Okay, all that information comes in handy, and I'll show you why. So first of all, at charge, we can make sure that we have enough energy. If our inlet temperature is high enough, the temperature of the air coming in the back of the machine is hot enough. If our charge temperature on our the exhaust temperature, if that's high enough, then the temperature of the air coming through the drum is hot enough, which means if the inlet's the right temperature and the exhaust is the right temperature, all the metal in between there is probably preheated to about the correct temperature. That helps us get our charge situation. Now, as we're dropping the coffee in and we start applying the heat, it's going to inform us of a few other things. One thing is going to be, am I applying enough heat energy now to hit my profile? So as you turn your burner up, what do you think happens to the inlet air temperature? Anybody? It goes up, exactly right. It goes up. It wasn't a trick question, I apologize. Everybody's kind of gun shy. Even though Ann Cooper and I are in the same room, we're not tricking 70 people into making the wrong answer like we did at Nice. Yeah, it goes up. When you turn up the burner, the inlet air temperature rises, okay? When you drop the coffee in, the exhaust air temperature, because it's measuring the airflow as it moves through the drum, as it moves through all those coffee beans, your air temperature is going to drop. So your exhaust air drops, your inlet goes up, okay? Both of these are going to help you track in the early stages when the bean temperature probe isn't super reliable, because it really just depends on what the bean temperature was when you dropped it in and what the coffee temperature was and how all your piece. And if you open the drum door just a little bit because you're worried about the burner kicking off for some reason, you just open it just a crack just to not get it to do that, and you close it again, and then it's all off. Anybody? Anybody? Nobody does that? Yeah. There's one honest person in the room. All right. During that fall, before you hit turning point, your air temperatures are a great guide to make sure that you're on the right track. To make sure that you didn't accidentally leave a setting incorrect on your airflow or drum speed, because it will show up quite immediately. To make sure that you're pushing enough heat energy in there as well. So for me, air temperatures are kind of like my silver bullet when it comes to roasting. If you want to know how to roast better, start looking at your air temperatures. The whole roast, okay? And we'll get more into that later as well. Burner settings. So the first thing I want to say is consistency is key, but because it's whose line is it anyway and everything's made up and the points don't matter, it doesn't mean that you make the same burner adjustments at the same point every single time. There's always going to be extenuating circumstances that could cause you to delay a burner adjustment by 30 seconds or to turn it down a little bit early. You have to be watching all the data roll in, all the small little details trickling in real time to know whether you should make your burner adjustment or not. We definitely run into this sometimes too, where you'll have a client that is roasting and they're like, I'm making all the same burner adjustments, my charge temperature was right on, and my coffee still doesn't look right. It's like, okay, well, you can't just do a burner recipe and expect it to come out right every single time. It unfortunately doesn't work that way. Note to anybody using bottled propane, as your bottle decreases, you might get a little bit less BTU output. And I see some nods in the room. Propane roasters, where you at? Me too. Yep, you know when you start getting to the end of that propane bottle and you're like, and I'm sluggish this roast a little bit. So do keep an eye on that. Please also note that your gas mix is going to vary. For that sort of thing, I would recommend talking to someone who works with roasting mechanics quite a lot. But liquid propane here is not the same as liquid propane elsewhere. Even sometimes in different places in the US, but also if you're talking internationally. If you go somewhere internationally, like I can remember, I think it was either Australia or New Zealand, a client of mine had 30% butane in their LP mix, and it melted their burner. Like literally melted it. So please note that the mixes are different. You might get better performance or worse performance than someone somewhere else with the exact same machine and exact same setup. Yeah, just pay really close attention to that. In order to learn, by the way, this is one of my home rigs. I'm installing new burners on it, and you can see the two new burners in the middle are the ones shooting straight up. They're a little overpowered at the moment. Need to tone those down just a bit. So. Drum speed settings. This is also really, really crucial. Our drum speed balances our amount of convection versus conduction. As you lower your drum speed, what happens is the beans lay against the metal for longer, increasing conductive heat energy transfer. They also don't get thrown up into the hot air as much, reducing convective heat energy transfer. So when you turn your drum speed down, you're shifting it that direction. Now, generally, a lower drum speed is going to cause longer roasts, and it increases the risks of scorching or facing, depending. So, which are two common roasting defects that you run into. The other thing that it does is it changes the sensitivity of the beans to control input changes. And this is huge, okay? If you have a faster drum speed, you can go faster at the beginning of the roast. And when you make a burner adjustment that lowers your air temperatures, because the beans are getting thrown up into it more frequently, it will also cause the beans to change course faster. So with a higher drum speed, when you make a burner adjustment down or an airspeed adjustment up, as that air cools off, the beans are going to register that cooling off faster. And so it will actually start to arrest your profile earlier, which can be really cool. So it helps you speed up and it helps you slow down. Both things at the same time. Now, if you start your drum speed going too fast and it ends up as a carnival ride and the beans get stuck to the wall, it's not going to help. So don't go that fast. So no centrifuges. Bring it down just a couple hairs from there. I had once knew a person that they had their Diedrich and they put their sprockets on wrong, and the drum speed kicked up so fast that they dropped the green coffee and then they couldn't hear it anymore. And they opened their drop door and nothing came out. And they couldn't figure out what was going on until they peeked inside and saw it was stuck against the wall like the alien saucer rides. Which are sickening as an adult, by the way. I have 3 young children, and we went on that more times than I would like to count at the most recent festival, and I felt ill for days. But anyway, don't do that to your coffee. Treat it with kindness. Treat it like an adult. The other thing, too, is I tend to shy away from RPM recommendations because, number one, I don't like to count. I'm just kidding. I have nothing against math. It's really hard to count RPMs, and it's not just about the drum size or diameter. It's also about the paddle design. We toured the Probat facility one time, and they wouldn't let us take pictures because they had a brand new paddle design that they didn't want anybody to take pictures of. It's that important, okay? So it's not just your diameter of your drum. It's not just the depth or size or anything that impacts how many RPMs you should have. It's also paddle design. So what I would recommend to you is this. I tend to like to get my coffee. So I'll take a coffee roaster. I'll put my green coffee in. I'll remove the hopper and plenum, which is the connector between the hopper and the drum. This is what we're looking into right here on my US roaster core, okay? I like to get to like 10 or 11 o'clock with my coffee beans, okay? Which just so happens to be pegged down on this one. But what I would do is I would recommend trying to increase your loft until you get there, because in the drum, the hot air strides. Hot air goes to the top, cooler air stays at the bottom. If you loft your coffee into the hottest air, you roast faster. So high recommendation for that. And when you make drum speed adjustments, I wouldn't recommend making it during the roast. Drum speed is like the temperature control in a gymnasium at school. You set it correctly, and then you put a glass box around it so none of the kids can mess with it. You picking up what I'm putting down? Yeah. If you could have your drum speed control inside of your electrical box so no one else can see it and tinker with it, that's what I would recommend. Because you want to set it to optimize your style of roasting on your roasting machine, and you don't want anybody to touch it. Because here's what can happen. This is kind of fun. It's Shark Week, as it turns out. Look at that. So right here, I'm covering it up with my finger. That's what's going on. So I charged in like normal. Right here, where that black line goes up and down, I made a drum speed adjustment to 50% speed. My exhaust air temperature shot up. Why do you think my exhaust air temperature shot up? Not a trick question, I promise.
Less coffee being where it was.
Yes, less coffee is impeding the airflow, and more importantly, less coffee stealing energy from our airflow, right? So when we steal less energy from the airflow, lo and behold, the airflow comes out high, okay? My bean temperature starts to decline, my rate of rise does this really weird drop move there. And then a little bit later, probably about 30 seconds or so later, I turn my drum speed back up to max. Okay? My air temperature immediately drops. And my rate of temperature gain does a little camel hump move, right? And I'm able to go and finish the roast. And a lot of my roasts, you'll see, I just take them the second crack and donate them. So the rest of the roast you can kind of ignore, but there's no reason to waste good coffee. So if it's good quality coffee, you might as well donate it to somebody who likes dark roasts and that sort of thing. So anyway, you can ignore everything past that. But if you make drum speed adjustments, you're not just changing how fast your coffee's roasting. You're also changing what your air temperature measurements mean. You're also changing the amount of bean probe coverage that you have because now you're lofting the coffee differently or more frequently. So it impacts everything. So I'd just say set it and forget it like a Ron Popeil rotisserie. Airflow settings are next. I just want to say this. We're talking about details. I'm cool with set it and forget it. If that works for your roaster and your style of roasting, and you can remove an additional variable, do it, right? However, airflow is really advantageous for various styles of roasting. And so sometimes you might need to use your airflow in order to do various things. So where are we here? Airflow settings will also change. This is a quick side note before we get into talking about what to do with it. Based on your weather. So if your weather changes or a weather pattern moves through and the ambient pressure changes outside of your roastery, or the temperature changes, you could get back pressure down your pipe. You could get less flow through of air. This can also change with buildup. So if you haven't cleaned your machines or your piping in some time, as buildup constricts, you're going to run into less and less airflow over time. And then your ventilation setup is also going to make a huge impact on that. So if your vent is on the side of the wall going straight out and the wind comes right into it, well, that's not helpful. There's various things that can impact your airflow. So even if you set your airflow to one thing, it might not always be the same. Okay. This is what happens when you change your airflow. So the green line, which may not show up as green to you. So the first line here is at 25% airflow. So it's just charging it at the same temperature, one burner setting, all the way to second crack. Okay. At 25%, what's really interesting is there's not enough airflow at the beginning of the roast to really get it to take off. And so you'll see my turning point is significantly lower, and I actually struggle to catch up until the midsection here. Then I catch up and overtake and overshoot. Duly note that the green roast, the 25% airflow, was also scorched like crazy. So 25% on the USRC, not a good call, okay? 50% airflow is this yellow line here, or yellow-orange, depending on how you see it. That one roasts quite a bit faster because as we trap heat energy in the hot box in which the drum is spinning, we're able to increase our inlet air temperature, and by increasing our inlet air temperature, we're increasing the rate of roasting for the coffee. Red is 75% and blue is at 100% the whole time. So you can see we make up some pretty big differences here. Now, generally speaking, if you need to roast fast and you want to make sure that you can slow down and do like a nice light roast, you might want to do something like 50% airflow at the beginning to make your hot box nice and hot, to increase the rate of roasting at the beginning of the roast, and then really early on, open your airflow up to start the process of cooling off. A lot of the roasts that I tend to do for my own preference, and granted my preference doesn't sell, I'm just telling you how I do it. If I wanted to sell in my local community, I'd hit second crack pretty much every time, just throwing that out there. But for my personal preference, I have my airflow at 50% until I hit my max rate of rise. Then I crank open my airflow to 100%. I actually have to spin it this way, so I don't know why I did it this way, but I crank it open 100%, which actually increases my max rate of rise even more because I'm throwing a lot of heat energy at it at once. This is the weird thing about airflow. When you make your airspeed adjustment, you're also stripping heat energy off the metal, and you're throwing airflow through at a higher volume, which means you will get a temporary bump in the speed at which the coffee roasts before it starts the cooling off process. Way to mitigate that is you could just do little bits of airflow change at a time, but if you want to do it all at once, you will get that like dramatic increase before it falls off. Then I'm at high airflow for the whole rest of the roast, so it helps me to start scrubbing the heat energy off the system so that I can slow down, hit first crack at a relatively low pace, and then have a nice development time to a low in temperature in color. Anyway, the other thing I would say is use a magnehelic. It's just a fancy word for a gauge that reads the volume of airflow based on pressure. So when we talk about roasting drum pressure, like if you're looking at a Gießen roaster, the roaster drum isn't actually pressurized because it would shoot the dryer out at you. Yeah. It's measuring the airflow. Okay, and so what a magnehelic, and you probably should go digital. I know Scott Rail likes to recommend digital magnehelics. You could totally do that. I'm a sucker for analog. I just love how they look. What this can tell you, and what this tells me when I'm roasting, is how the weather system has changed my roasting environment. So when I'm roasting, I actually adjust my airflow to a magnehelic setting, and then I know I've got the same volume of airflow movement every single time. Okay? Some days I go in and it's off by 0.5 because some sort of weird weather systems move through. So getting something like this that helps you track that is awesome. This is another one of those small little trivial bits of detail that you should probably be looking at when you're roasting. You can also mark it on your crop stir artisan. So instead of just saying like some random number, because like 50% on your dampener is not 50% airflow, 50% on your variable frequency drive isn't probably actually 50% airflow. So you could actually write down your magnehelic numbers and you have something to work on. Anyway, beside the point. So now we're moving on to what it means to roast consistently by looking at little trivial details as well. So I'm going to ask you the question first. What do you mean by consistency? Taste the same. All right, we got taste the same. Anybody? Bueller.
Color. Rose color.
Rose color, right on. What else?
Weight loss.
Weight loss, right on. This side of the room is crushing you guys away. Somebody from over here, what does it mean for you to be consistent?
Time and temp.
Time and temp, right on.
Color.
Color, awesome.
Surface texture.
Ooh, I like that. They're still crushing you. No, surface texture is great because it is actually a visual indication of expansion, which can be a proxy for how much you've roasted the coffee, which is fabulous. So when we're talking about what is consistency, we're going to talk about a few things. So for me, what consistency means is this, and I'll just kind of rattle off a whole bunch of numbers that may or may not be meaningless to you. Plus or minus 10 seconds to any major target. So if I need to hit first crack at 9 minutes, I need to be at 8:50 to 9:10. That's a pretty big window, but I've also worked as a production roaster long enough to know that it's not always perfect, right? This is what I would do for production roasting, plus or minus 10 seconds, okay? Plus or minus 10 seconds of development time, which is a huge window once again, but you know, you got to be gracious to your production roasters, yeah? Otherwise you spend all of your time cupping roasts that are totally fine. So plus or minus 10 seconds to any time-based target. Temperature-wise, plus or minus a couple degrees Fahrenheit depending, because the end temperature isn't actually the best indicator of finished roast color, always, because it really depends on what you're doing. My record is I've been able to get a 14 degrees centigrade skew to hit the same roast color by doing really weird stuff at the end of the roast. So, for example, if you crank your gas up at the end of the roast, wouldn't recommend doing it, but if you do that, what happens is your air temperature skyrocket, and our bean probe, although we love to say that it's actually reading bean temperature, it's not. It's reading an amalgamation of bean temperature and air temperature. So when you just shoot your air temperatures up to the moon, the bean temperature measurement actually starts going up before the beans themselves respond to the heat energy transfer. And so what happens is you can actually end at 14 degrees C hotter and get the same color if, say, you went to 70% gas instead of 30% gas at the end of the roast, which once again, I'm not saying that's the best flavor, I'm just saying it's possible. So in temperature is always a little wiggly. Color on the Agtron scale for me, plus or minus 3. Weight loss, plus or minus 0.25%. I will sometimes allow up to 0.5% before I start to worry. If it's above 0.5%, I can almost guarantee that I've got a roast color variance that is outside of spec for me, and then the colors or the flavor is going to be out of spec. Now, what Todd said earlier, flavor, that's super important, because what I want to tell you is this. Roast color is 80% of flavor. Development time is probably 15 to 20%, and when you hit first crack is the other 5 to 10%, and everything else is fairly trivial. That's what I want to tell you. What I've practically experienced is that really, really small nuanced changes in roasting will still show up on the table. They may not be noticeable in a triangulation very easily. Your customers probably won't notice or care. But I don't want to give the impression that small things don't matter, especially since I named the presentation Devil in the Details. So every small detail is horribly important. That's what I'll say with that. When you're roasting, your air temperature should be consistent. You'll see with this roast, which I managed to do successfully, I of course did not put on my presentation slide all of the roasts that I failed miserably at, because that wouldn't spoke confidence, would it? You can see here my inlet air temperature is roughly the same the whole roast. I've got a little bit of a noisy probe. It's a 1.5 millimeter grounded, so it gets a little bit of electrical interference, and it's a really long metal shaft too, so it's like a giant antenna. But it works for what I need. My exhaust air temperature, you can see, is pretty on point the whole time, and as a result, my bean temperature is pretty good the whole time, and my rate of rise is pretty good the whole time. These were a successful match. But I'm using my air temperature, and I'm paying attention to my air temperature while I'm roasting. And what you'll see when I get to the next slide, or the slide after, it's the next slide, is that my air temperatures look cohesive, but check out my burner. I had to delay some of my burner changes. And I was only able to intelligently decide to make these burner changes later because I was able to see my air temperatures. Because my bean temperature is on the whole time. So theoretically, I should have just made the same burner adjustments every single time. But that would have actually resulted in the blue roast being a bit slower, or the red roast being a bit faster. I can't remember which one went first. So see, air temperature is consistent. Minor changes in my burner controls. Nothing huge, but still pretty consistently different. Yes, and I circled and put a big asterisk next to see beyond burner settings. And I did forget one thing. Let me go back to this real quick. These are your early warning indicators. So as heat energy flows through the system, it goes inlet, exhaust, and then bean, because bean is a lagging indicator. Technically, the beans are exposed to the heat between inlet and exhaust, but since they're organic material, they take a little longer to make that change. So inlet air comes in, exhaust air goes out, beans change third. So if I notice a change in my inlet temperature, I should start paying attention. If I then see a change in my exhaust temperature, I need to make an adjustment to make sure that I'm going to stay on target. If I do that, I can avoid seeing a difference show up in my bean temperature. Okay? Usually we don't see it in bean temperature first. We usually see it in rate of rise, but that's an issue of scale. Our bean temperature is measured in hundreds of degrees centigrade on that scale, where we're only like 25 degrees C on the rate of rise scale. So small differences show up on rate of rise first, even though it's a derivative of bean temperature. So bean temperature is usually the last thing that you see change. So anyway, this is what consistent controls means. And I was really lucky. I was able to just do 100% flat out air the whole time. So you can see there's no adjustments there. This is with a Katura from Colombia, just as a heads up. And here you can see the timings, right? So roughly the same green to yellow, roughly the same through the Maillard, and then roughly the same in development. End of roast temperature, you can see here that we are actually a little under 2 degrees centigrade difference to get to the same roast color. So, or about 3 degrees Fahrenheit difference. So this is whole bean 57 versus 56. And ground 1023 versus 1014. Oh, and this is just to showcase, I forgot we're on a different roast here. This is just to showcase how meaningless color is when we're talking about everything overall. So these are the same color, slightly different in temperatures, but look how wildly different the roast is. Will these coffees taste the same? No, absolutely not. Could I pick them out on a triangulation? Depends on the day, right? Let's all be honest. If I had a cinnamon roll, probably not. All right, post-roasting. All of the little bits and details and pieces that we put together here at the end of the roast by looking at our weight loss percentage. This scale is just kind of for help if you need it. Anything under 11%, I generally suggest is too light. And I think I maybe got the under symbol backwards, so. Yeah, I did, in fact. Anything less than 11, I generally consider to be not safe, with exceptions. Usually 11 to 13% is kind of in that light roast territory. 14 to 16% you're at a medium. 17 to 18 at a dark. 19 to 21 very dark. And if you're going above 21%, I admire your appetite for risk. Generally speaking, my goal is to hit the same weight loss percentage always. I do allow a wiggle of 0.25% or up to 0.5% if I'm talking production roasting staff. But then anything outside of that is bad. Not necessarily. It might be totally fine. You should always cup and triangulate, because if you're choosing not to sell coffee without tasting it, like, that's a huge financial hit. Why would you do that? You should always taste it first. Sometimes you'll be surprised. I think different coffees too have different levels of toleration. Like, we had a natural process Nicaraguan one time when I worked at NOSA that hit, our production roaster hit a minute short on development time. Not insignificant. No one on the entire production team could find it on the table when we did a triangulation. And so do you know what happened? Happy customers got that coffee. Color, plus or minus 3 on the Itron scale. Color track is a little bit different, and then other scales are smaller. So, for example, if you're the proud owner of an Roast Division from Espresso Division, which doesn't make them anymore, if you're outside of the exact numerical value, then it's off. Because with the Espresso Division, it was, if you were 1 point off, it was about 4 points Itron different. So, generally speaking, with color, I would recommend taking 3 measurements and averaging them, especially for whole bean, because whole bean can be a little wily. It's also about how you prep it. Most of them are based on the distance to the sensor. And so for those who are production roasters, if you need to fudge your numbers a little bit, if you need it lighter, just put a little bit more in. If you need it a little darker, put a little less in. But for those of you who care and are trying to do well, and business owners, you didn't hear that, what you're going to do is you just got to make sure that it's the exact same height every single time. It's like puck prep for training baristas. Your entire roasting staff needs to be trained to produce it the exact same way, because if they're not, you're going to get different color measurements person to person. Okay. So. Oh, and also weight loss. I have this underlined like four times here. Take weight loss every time. Did I say that earlier? It's free. It's free. The last thing, and this is once again what Todd Arnett pointed out, flavor. This is a big thing for consistency. Okay, if the coffee tastes the same, that is the ideal. We are in the business, as Ian Cooper would say, of flavor. That's what we are doing. We are producing a flavorful product. And if it doesn't taste the same, that's a problem. And if it does taste the same, then that's great. And flavor is really, really important. The way that you monitor that, I leave to you. Ideally, we would have some sort of scale that we could all use together, but that doesn't always work out, right? Figuring out what is important to your business and what's important to your team to note in terms of the flavor of the coffee for getting into the details probably isn't going to be the SCA cupping form, right? So find what works for you and do that, and then do it consistently. Okay. One of the things I would also recommend, we did this at NOSA a lot back when I worked there. Every opportunity to brew coffee is an opportunity to rate flavor. And so we gave all the production team access to Cropster Cup, and all of them would rate the coffees we drank in the morning on a very simplistic scale. And this is really important, because I know how all of you are, because I know how I am. We like to drink the fun coffees every morning, don't we? And we forget what the French roast tastes like brewed, right? Have a rotating schedule for which coffees get brewed in your production facility every day, so that at least once a week, the French roast gets on. At least once a week, the decaf gets on, and these get tasted. And everyone on your production team tastes them and scores them. And then you have all this like long-running data, and you can catch things. For example, is our grinder drifting? Is something wrong with our water? Something off with the roast? It can be really, really helpful, because a lot of times when we just cup things, we lose sight of that. And frankly, dark roasts don't cup super well, so I would actually prefer brewing them or French pressing them or something. Other data worth taking, because when we are done roasting it, it's not done. We can't just say, we've hit our targets. Good, wonderful. We also should be looking at measurements post-grinding. Some of you might have an in-house quality management person. That's awesome. Most of us probably don't. How many people are the in-house quality management? as well as the roaster, and green buyer, and owner, maybe, and salesperson, and delivery driver. You're doing it the whole time. I'm so sorry. Grinding is really, really important because grinders aren't ubiquitous. And they're not consistent to the point where they don't drift. Grinder drift is a real thing. It happens over time. The more coffee you grind, the more the grinder will eventually drift. And different coffees will grind differently on the grinder. This is the part that we don't like to acknowledge, especially when we're doing a cupping. We're like, oh, we're evaluating all these coffees the same. They don't all grind the same. It doesn't work. Grind particle distribution pattern. So all of the green were ground on one grind setting, and all of the white were ground on another grind setting. But they're different coffee varieties. Lo and behold, they don't grind the same, despite having the same roast profiles. They grind very differently from one another, don't they? So, if you're working in a cafe, anybody who's worked as a barista knows you sometimes have to make small incremental adjustments to the grinder for espresso when you get a different coffee in, or small incremental adjustments for the brewed coffee if you're brewing a different coffee here and there. So paying attention to your grind particle analysis can be really important. Also, after brewing, you should be checking your brewing regularly to make sure that it's all working together well. And knowing kind of where you're roasting. So we don't live in this bubble, so to say. Everything that we do, every interpretation that we make in our coffee is based on an interlinkage with something else. The way that you brew changes the way that you roast. Unless you're only chewing roasted coffee beans for evaluation. The way you grind changes the way you roast. Your coffee to water ratio changes the way that you roast. All of this does. And so you should do it with knowledge. So when I was working for Nosa, their production team, we knew that we were always roasting for a 16:1 coffee to water ratio. That's what we used on our cupping table. That's what we did in all of our batch brewers. Everything across the entire board was consistent. We were doing it for a particular place in the extraction ideal window as well. We were aiming for roughly 18.5 to 19% at about 1.32 total solubles in concentration. That was our target. And our roasting was to meet the best flavor profile we could within that range. Okay. If you change your cupping table and suddenly you go from, say, an 18:1 to a 16:1, the coffee is going to taste different. If you go from an 18.5% extraction yield to a 22% extraction yield, the coffee is going to taste different. All of these things matter. Also, just kind of a side note, we increased our sales by actually starting to include little business cards with brewing instructions on the samples we dropped off with people. Because if you just drop somebody a sample and no guidance, why would you do that? Why did I do that? I don't know. They brew it however they brew it, and then they say, oh, no, we don't want your coffee. It doesn't taste very good. And then you go back and you brew it for them, and lo and behold, they're like, oh, wow, this is delicious. Yeah, we'll buy some. Help people out just a little bit. And then we put it all together. Everything is interconnected. The green coffee metrics that we take impact everything. It impacts how we brew it. It impacts our expectations on grinding based on coffee variety, density, hardness, etc. Our grinding impacts our post-roast measurements because the way you grind it impacts your ground color meter readings. It impacts the way that you choose to roast because you're actually roasting to make the coffee taste a certain way for the grind size that you're using in your cupping bowls. If you change the grind size that you're using in your cupping bowls or switch grinders, everything tastes different on the cupping table and can then influence your roasting. All of these little details that we've talked about all fit together. They all impact one another. And I'm not saying this to overwhelm you. What I'm saying is the first step toward any sort of practical approach or change is acknowledgement. Knowing that all of these things interplay, knowing that they all interact, and being cognizant of that, taking down the detailed information for each coffee as you're going about it is just going to make you a better roaster. Even if you never take a class with anyone, you can teach yourself a lot through this process of what do you like, what do you not like, how did this work, how did that work, etc. So I would encourage you to kind of keep this all just in your mind every day when you roast. Every time you get a chance to take down information, and please don't do what I did, put it somewhere where you can find it again. writing it down on little note cards and stuff is great, but then where do the note cards live? Have some sort of system worked out. This is where data management systems like Cropster or Artisan or even just a really nice Excel file can come in super handy because it can all live in one spot where everyone can access it. Instead of either living in your brain, and this is a problem that we as roasters have sometimes. How many people are worried about their job? I'm just kidding, don't do it because your boss is here, right? No, but we're all worried about becoming obsolete. Heck, I worry about becoming obsolete all the time, right? And it's because you get used to it. Oh, I hope so. It can't just live in your head. It can't. Because what if something happens to you? What if you have to go to the hospital for a little bit of time? Heaven forbid, right? Everyone else is left picking up the pieces. And then you may not have as cool of a job to come back to because they might have been struggling for quite some time. So have redundancies, have fallbacks, have systems in place, train people on your systems, work really, really hard to not be the only thing holding the company together. Right? And also, I'm going to say this real quick too before we get to the question part here. I don't believe that anything in coffee roasting is a moral choice. Whether you roast dark, light, high weight loss, low weight loss, any of that. I do believe that coffee buying is a moral choice. And if you look here, all of this influences our coffee buying. Okay? The problem is when we aren't aware of it and how we're being influenced. So you might say, like, I don't like any Katuras. Okay? And that might influence who you're buying from. It could just be that you don't know how to roast Katura. Just throwing that out there. It could be that the green sample you got was too fresh. There have been a number of times where I've stayed with the partnership that I have with the farmer, even though the sample didn't taste good, and bought it and said, you know what? I trust you. I trust that this coffee is good because I bought from you year over year. This sample did not work out so hot. And it showed up sometimes 4 points higher than what I cupped it on the sample roast. Was it that the coffee was wrong on the sample roast? Was it maybe it was wrong? You don't want to say that stuff out loud, do you? Maybe you didn't sample roast it well. And that changed who you decided to buy from or what you decided to buy. Or maybe the feedback that we're giving to producers saying, oh, well, these varieties that are really finicky and not rust resistant, you need to plant these because they're better. But what if they're not? What if we just forgot how to approach other varieties or didn't think it through? So I would just say that even though I wouldn't say roasting is a moral decision, it's you do you, a lack of awareness can't hurt other people. So that's kind of all I got for that.